Over the course of the last decade, the Syrian government has conducted over 400 attacks on healthcare facilities. Through these war strategies and countless others, 6.7 million Syrians have been internally displaced, with another 6.6 having fled Syria. Our report explores the nexus between these two statistics through the lived experiences of displaced Syrians. My name is Hibah Sidiqui, and I am a member of the 2020-2021 fact-finding team. I wanted to start by saying thank you all for being with us today as we present our findings from our virtual fact-finding mission, titled No Choice, Analyzing Attacks on Health as a Driver of Forcible Displacement in Syria. Though we're presenting now, our report is forthcoming. We'll make sure everyone attending this conference will have access to our published report in May of 2021. Our presentation will begin with a brief introduction and overview. But before that, I wanted to take a moment to say thank you to our professors, Professor Stewart and Professor Gilmore, for their guidance throughout this year, as well as to Georgetown for its continual support of our mission. Finally, and most importantly, I want to say thank you to our interviewees, who took time out of their busy schedules to navigate virtual interviews and share their lived experiences with us. During our virtual fact-finding mission, we interviewed 39 Syrian civilians and healthcare workers displaced from both opposition and government-held areas. Our report and presentation has replaced each of their names with pseudonyms to protect their privacy and safety. We'll begin with our research question, then turn to our 3 core factual findings, which Juliana Lord, Jacob Demree, and I will discuss. Dennis Blumenfeld, Aysha Chowdhry, and Elizabeth Fray will then follow with our legal conclusions under international human rights law and international criminal law. Finally, Jacob Demree will discuss our recommendations to the international community before we open up our presentation to questions. This report documents our investigation into drawing new connections between attacks on healthcare and waves of displacement in the decade-long Syrian conflict. Our research question was inspired by the ICC's novel pre-trial chamber decision. This decision looked into how the Rome Statute's criminalization of cross-border displacement could become a mode of accountability against Myanmar in the Rohingya crisis. Similarly, our report seeks to explore how third-party states, such as Jordan, may be able to create criminal accountability against the Syrian government for its attacks on healthcare. These government attacks on healthcare infrastructure are well documented in Syria because of the work of countless Syrians on the ground over the last 10 years. The waves of displacement that make the Syrian conflict one of the worst humanitarian crises of the 21st century is also well documented, with millions of Syrians displaced. Our interviews focused explicitly on the connection between these two circumstances. Though countless actors have contributed to the displacement of Syrian civilians, we hope that our research can set a foundation for creating accountability against the Syrian government. The waves of displacement that characterize the Syrian conflict have not been directly connected to attacks on the right to health. This gap is what our research question seeks to fill. More specifically, we analyze criminal accountability and how attacks on healthcare can be understood as crimes against humanity under the crime of forcible displacement. Our research question is whether there have been systematic attacks on healthcare in Syria, and if so, whether these systematic attacks constitute a coercive environment contributing to forcible displacement under international criminal law. With that being said, I'd like to pass it over to Juliana Lord to discuss our first factual finding.
Now we will discuss our 3 factual findings, starting with the first. The first factual finding is that pro-government forces, and that means Syrian military, security, intelligence personnel, also including other actors like Russian military, Iranian Revolutionary Guard, and Hezbollah, engaged in 4 main patterns of violent actions aimed at denying healthcare services to segments of the Syrian population that they perceived as opposed to the government. These 4 main patterns that we identified: first, that Syrian security military forces detained and subjected healthcare workers to acts amounting to torture and extrajudicial killings. Second, security forces and medical workers at state-controlled hospitals physically and psychologically abused patients they perceived as opposed to the Syrian government. Third, Pro-government forces directed and carried out attacks against hospitals, field clinics, ambulances, and other civilian healthcare infrastructure. And fourth, that security and military forces prevented civilians from accessing medical care and supplies by restricting their freedom of movement. So first, attacks on healthcare workers. Since 2011, government security forces arrested and detained medical personnel if they were treating or were perceived as treating protesters or members of the opposition. Security forces detained ambulance drivers, pharmacists, and healthcare volunteers at checkpoints, especially if they had medical supplies on them. Fareed, one of our interviewees, was a doctor providing medical aid and training to Aleppo demonstrators in 2012. He was seized from his car by pro-government armed attackers after they found his medical school student ID and a list of medical equipment that he had. He was then detained by the government, interrogated for names of other doctors he knew, and tortured before later being released. Government security and military forces also killed medical workers. Physicians for Human Rights documented 930 medical personnel killed since 2011, and they have attributed 91% of killings to Syrian government forces or Russian allied forces. Fatima, one of the people that we interviewed, said that government forces detained her neighbor, a pharmacist, at a checkpoint after finding medication in his car. He was killed and she later saw his body. She said, "We could see on his face the bruises and on his fingers the bruises of torture." Second, torture in hospitals. Syrian security forces in state and military hospitals interrogated patients, especially protesters and detainees, in some cases chaining injured patients to their beds, beating and electrocuting them, and denying them water and medical attention. Doctors, nurses, and other medical workers in state and military hospitals also abused patients perceived as opposing the government, especially detainees. For example, doctors urinated on patients, unqualified medical personnel performed surgeries on them, and they withheld anesthesia and pain medication during and after these procedures. Medical personnel or security forces also put multiple detainees or injured protesters in the hospital's morgue when they arrived, even though they were still alive. Witnesses we interviewed told us that doctors also came to prisons and killed detainees there, sometimes in front of other detainees. Rifat, one of the people we interviewed, was detained in Sednaya twice. He said that sick and injured detainees were sent to Tishreen Hospital nearby, and at least 5 of his fellow detainees were killed there, as other fellow detainees witnessed. Mohammed, a fellow detainee, went to the hospital to have his wounds cleaned. Instead, he was handcuffed to the bed, where doctors urinated on his wounds. Others were beaten by medical professionals. Rifat said they learned not to say that they were injured to avoid going to Tishreen Hospital. Rifat said that he and fellow detainees were scared of going back to hospitals after being released, especially public hospitals. Third, attacks on medical facilities. Syrian and allied military forces have directed and carried out hundreds of attacks on medical facilities and medical transport since 2011, which often crippled the facility temporarily or permanently and injured or killed patients and medical personnel. They also conduct double taps, which means they attack the same spot twice in quick succession to injure more people, especially first responders and medics. The attacks that people told us about in interviews were easy to corroborate because there's so much documentation of these attacks, especially like entities such as Physicians for Human Rights. And according to Physicians for Human Rights, Syrian and allied forces carried out 536 attacks on medical facilities between March 2011 and February 2020. And this is over 90% of all such attacks. Amira is an OBGYN doctor who was working in an Aleppo hospital during the conflict. She said her hospital was bombed 10 to 15 times during the conflict. She and her fellow doctors would fix everything as quickly as possible after an attack, salvage the medical equipment and supplies that hadn't been destroyed, and go back to work. One day when she couldn't be at work, a missile hit the hospital room where she normally examined her patients. Amira said that because of the frequent attacks on hospitals, her patients stopped going to the hospital when they needed necessary care. Her hospital was completely destroyed in late 2016. And fourth, restrictions on the freedom of movement. Government and military forces restricted freedom of movement and prevented civilians perceived as opposed to the government from accessing medical treatment and supplies, sometimes leading patients to die in transit to another medical facility. Multiple people we interviewed told us that in addition to the checkpoints, government snipers were stationed on buildings along roads and near these checkpoints and indiscriminately shot at civilians perceived to be opposition members. Patients and medical personnel had to move between towns or neighborhoods at night with their lights off to try and avoid detection and targeting. Usama, one of the people we interviewed, needed surgery that he couldn't get in his own town, so he had to travel to another hospital for treatment. He traveled with his mother and 2 of his aunts. His father checked in advance so they would know when it was safest to travel along the road. He had to cross a checkpoint and did so when soldiers were preparing to leave for the day, so he wasn't stopped. After his surgery, they had to go through the checkpoint again. Usama laid in the back seat of the car and pretended to still be asleep from the anesthesia so that they would get through the checkpoint because, quote, it just looked like 3 ladies, end quote. He said, the fear of arrest was so stressful, it was an awful experience. Now Jacob Demree will discuss our second factual finding.
Thanks, Juliana. Our second finding is that the compound effects of the government's weaponization of health have decimated Syria's healthcare system, leaving it unable to meet the civilian population's needs. Specifically, we find that attacks on health have systematically undermined the health system, producing several system failures, specifically in the areas of medical infrastructure, supplies, and personnel. Because of attacks on health, Syria's healthcare infrastructure is insufficient to meet the needs of the civilian population. Our interviews illuminated numerous examples of hospitals and clinics that were attacked and destroyed. For example, as Juliana explained, Amira was a doctor at the M2 hospital in eastern Aleppo. Over the second half of 2016, the Syrian government attacked that hospital several times, ultimately succeeding in destroying it. By the end of the year, the government forces had completely destroyed it. And in 2016, November of 2016, the World Health Organization announced that there are no longer any functional hospitals remaining in eastern Aleppo. So despite the efforts of doctors like Amira, the government's attacks on health were able to completely eradicate eastern Aleppo's hospital infrastructure. And this example is more widespread. Across Syria, 90% of the population lives in an area where the number of available hospital beds falls below emergency standards. Second, because of the government's chokehold on the movement of medical supplies, essential equipment and drugs are often unavailable. Medical professionals, especially in field hospitals, medical points, and public hospitals, often have to compensate for the lack of available supplies. And for example, we have Ahmad's story, which shows the patient's perspective. Ahmad was severely wounded in his head and his leg during a shelling, and so he was taken to a medical point for emergency care. At the medical point, he received an emergency operation, but without anesthesia. We know, and other sources have verified, that the Syrian government restricts the delivery of anesthetics. Later, Ahmad was moved to a field hospital, but there was a shortage of supplies there as well, and the doctors could only temporarily treat his leg injury. Ahmad had to leave Syria to get the needed treatment. So not only did the available treatments cause undue pain in the form of a surgery without anesthesia, he still wasn't able to have his injuries healed while remaining in Syria. These shortages may exacerbate further the coronavirus pandemic. Mahdi's a Syrian refugee, and he told us that he believes that hospitals don't have enough oxygen to treat patients with severe COVID-19 symptoms. While we didn't find direct evidence of this relationship, our interviews and other sources probably corroborate this belief. For example, when there are chemical attacks, the field hospitals don't have enough oxygen in many cases to treat the victims of those chemical attacks. Amnesty International and others additionally have documented the Syrian government's response to the coronavirus pandemic and have reached similar conclusions. Finally, attacks on health injure, kill, and force out medical professionals. There just aren't enough doctors remaining in Syria. Since the start of the conflict, nearly 1,000 medical professionals have been killed, and nearly 70% of medical professionals have fled Syria. This leads to widespread shortages. Amira described how she avoided taking days off of work because if she didn't show up one day, there'd be a long line of patients waiting for specialized care outside of her door. There just weren't enough doctors in eastern Aleppo to provide care. Several of our interviewees also described how they would try to compensate for the insufficient number of adequately trained medical professionals. Elias, for example, trained other doctors to provide trauma surgery, even if those doctors weren't themselves trained in providing trauma care. Sarah didn't have any medical training whatsoever, but she served as a nurse in a medical point. And this medical point, which provided emergency care, was run by a dentist and medical students. So the government's attacks on health, consequently, have caused health system failures. They've led to insufficient numbers of available infrastructure, supplies, and personnel. So based on these and other facts, we find that attacks on health have decimated services in Syria and left the healthcare system unable to meet the Syrian population's needs. Next, I'd like to introduce Hibah Sidiqui, who will discuss our third factual finding.
Our final set of factual findings explains how attacks on healthcare infrastructure have contributed to forcible displacement. The Syrian government's assault on healthcare can be seen as both a primary driver of displacement as well as a contributing driver. Throughout the course of the last decade, millions of Syrians have been internally displaced or have left Syria. Much of this displacement can be attributed to the failure of armed groups on both sides of the conflict from taking necessary precautions to spare civilians' lives. This lack of precaution also leads to the destruction of necessary infrastructure, such as healthcare facilities and hospitals. For some displaced Syrians, the inability to access healthcare was a primary driver of their displacement. This is particularly true for those seeking specialized care, as well as those who had witnessed family members and friends lose their lives due to an inability to access emergency care. For Syrians seeking specialized care, such as those with serious heart conditions or those battling cancer, their options to obtain healthcare were already limited. As with most other countries around the world, access to specialized care is typically located in regions of a country that are more heavily populated, leaving more rural populations with an additional burden of travel to seek care. In the context of Syria, multiple interviewees informed us that prior to the conflict, specialized care for heart conditions and cancer was available only in Aleppo and Damascus. Due to the Syrian government's siege of Aleppo and the subsequent decimation of healthcare infrastructure, specialized care was only available in Damascus. As an oncologist working for the Syrian American Medical Society explained, patients diagnosed with cancer either die of the disease or they have to go to Damascus. But travel to Damascus could create a new host of issues, particularly for patients who are perceived to be associated with opposition groups. One witness recalled how her father's treatment in Damascus was dependent on her signing a reconciliation agreement with the Syrian government. Fearing arrest and torture by traveling to a government-held region, she instead fled her hometown of Ghouta for northwest Syria. From there, her father was evacuated to Turkey. Amna's example is just one that highlights how those with serious health conditions were forced to choose between leaving Syria for care or obtaining care in hostile territory held by the government that directly threatened their physical existence because they could be perceived to be associated with opposition. Because of this, some interviewees felt that they couldn't rely on infrastructure within Syria to obtain care. Another primary driver of displacement was a lack of confidence in available services. One witness, Ali, explained that he repeatedly sought care with doctors in Syria because he was experiencing fevers and sweating. However, due to a lack of resources, doctors were only able to conduct basic blood tests, all of which failed to reveal an explanation for his fevers. Because he didn't have confidence in the doctor's diagnoses or in the resources that they used to make those diagnoses, Ali consulted a friend working in the medical field. He came to the conclusion that he had no choice but to leave Syria and get an additional opinion in Turkey. There, Ali was diagnosed with blood cancer. He's since made a full recovery, and his home in Turkey has now become a safe place for other Syrians to stay while receiving medical treatment in Turkey. Ali's experience is indicative of how the assault on healthcare created a deep lack of confidence in any available medical services. That itself became a primary driver of displacement for some Syrians. Yet the inability to access adequate medical care was not limited to Syrians seeking specialized care, like Ali or Amna's father. It also applied to those seeking emergency care for superficial wounds. Witnesses recalled being told by doctors that they were unable to be treated because there was no medical equipment. Others recalled family members or friends who died from a lack of adequate care, such as blood poisoning from a bullet that couldn't be taken out of the wound. This was the case for Samir. Finding himself with a similar bullet wound later in the conflict, Samir felt that he had no choice but to flee Syria in order to ensure he received the care that his family members didn't have access to. With Samir and some others, we see how a lack of confidence in medical expertise, as well as a lack of available care, became a driving factor for displacement. While attacks on healthcare and the subsequent unmet needs were primary drivers of displacement for some Syrians, other displaced Syrians felt as though the lack of access to care simply contributed to numerous other factors that led them to flee Syria. Numerous witnesses cited a lack of healthcare as an additional factor, along with the general climate of insecurity and lack of safety that they came to associate with life in Syria. This lack of security stemmed from the Syrian government's violent and indiscriminate attacks on civilian populations. It also stemmed from the direct attacks on healthcare infrastructure. While many of our witnesses explained how their physical safety was constantly at risk while living in Syria, they also explained that their safety continued to be at risk if they sought to obtain care after a government attack. At its core, for many displaced Syrians, it was a lack of physical safety that was the primary driver of displacement, though it's well documented that attacks on healthcare were often correlated with waves of displacement in Syria. And in many interviews, therefore, it wasn't clear that a lack of medical care was the driving factor. Instead, it was an additional, though significant, contributing factor in the larger scheme of the inability to obtain safety, food, shelter, and other necessities of life. This scarcity, coupled with the larger fear of violence and death at the hands of the Syrian government, all contributed to the displacement of millions of Syrians. Ultimately, attacks on healthcare contributed to the displacement of Syrians, both internally and across international borders. These attacks created a shortage of supplies, of hospitals, and of trained and experienced medical personnel. Yet because they were indiscriminate, or were often specifically targeting civilians, the attacks also called into question the physical safety of obtaining care in Syria or remaining in Syria at all. These together, both indirectly and directly, pushed many civilians to leave their homes. This displacement and the attacks on healthcare that instigated it can be analyzed under international law. I'd like to pass it over to Dennis Blumenfeld to begin the legal analysis of our findings under international human rights law.
Thanks, Hibah. As Hibah mentioned, I will discuss our findings under international human rights law, and afterwards, two of my classmates will discuss international criminal law. We find that the patterns of attacks on health violated the right to health and contributed to a coercive environment. This coercive environment deprived the population of a genuine choice to remain. Later, my classmate, Elizabeth Fray, will discuss this finding in more detail as it relates to international criminal law. In regard to international human rights law, states parties recognize the right to health, defined as the right of everyone to the enjoyment of the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health. The right to health is found in the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, to which Syria acceded. The right to health includes rights that are essential to tolerable living conditions. Key elements of the right to health are quality, availability, accessibility, and acceptability. Underlying determinants of health, including health facilities, trained medical personnel, and essential drugs, have to be available in sufficient quality in a state. Health facilities, goods, and services have to be available to everyone without discrimination and be physically and economically accessible. Healthcare must be acceptable on the basis of medical ethics, cultural appropriateness, and gender sensitivity. The right to health attaches to additional rights, such as the right to life guaranteed under Article 6 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, to which Syria also acceded. The duty to protect life implies that states parties should take appropriate measures to ensure access to essential health care. The Syrian government violated the right to health. Pro-government forces' attacks on healthcare workers created a shortage of medical professionals in violation of the rights to available and quality care. In interviews, healthcare workers described being detained and tortured because of their work. Witnesses highlighted how government hospital personnel distinguished care based on civilians' perceived political affiliation in violation of non-discrimination norms of the right to health. Witnesses described how they avoided hospitals until absolutely necessary because they feared they may be harmed rather than receive care, violating their right to access health care. Witnesses feared attending and remaining at care facilities for extended periods of time because of pro-government forces' aerial attacks on healthcare facilities in violation of Syrians' right of access to quality care. Syrians' fear of going to public hospitals likely exacerbated pre-conflict disparities in care between public and private hospitals in violation of the rights of healthcare access and non-discrimination on the basis of socioeconomic status. Attacks by pro-government forces on the transport of medical supplies violated the right to the availability of care. Witnesses described the need to smuggle medical supplies. Witnesses recounted how they feared leaving their homes, including to get medical care, because of curfews, checkpoints, road surveillance, and snipers, which violated their right to accessible health care. I will now turn it over to my classmate, Aysha Chowdhry.
Thank you, Dennis. Under customary international law and numerous international criminal statutes, crimes against humanity are certain acts such as murder, extermination, deportation, and other inhumane acts committed as part of a widespread or systematic attack against a civilian population. We focus on crimes against humanity of deportation or forcible transfer as an avenue for the prosecution of forced displacement caused by the attacks on healthcare. Our factual findings reiterate conclusions by the Commission of Inquiry that there have been widespread and systematic attacks against civilians in Syria. Based upon customary international law, the Rome Statute defines deportation or forcible transfer as the forced displacement of the persons concerned by expulsion or other coercive acts from the area in which they are lawfully present without grounds permitted under international law. First, forced displacement includes both deportation and forcible transfer. Deportation occurs across an international border. Forcible transfer occurs within an international border. We found that civilians were deported because Syrians were forcibly displaced across a national border. Our witnesses say they were living in Syria and now they live in other countries such as Turkey, Jordan, Lebanon, and the UK. Second, expulsion or other coercive acts does not just include physical force. It may also include the threat of force or coercion, such as that caused by fear of violence, duress, detention, psychological oppression, or abuse of power against such person or another person, or by taking advantage of a coercive environment. The key factor is voluntariness. The analysis depends on the manifestation of individual intent and consent, taking the context, situation, and atmosphere into account. We found that the attacks on and deprivation of healthcare amounted to the forcible displacement of Syrians because the context, situation, and atmosphere prevailing in Syria created by the attacks on healthcare resulted in a coercive environment. And this coercive environment was calculated to deprive the population of a genuine choice to remain. According to case law, the context, situation, and atmosphere creating the lack of genuine choice may be inferred from threatening and intimidating acts that are calculated to deprive the civilian population of exercising its free will, such as the shelling of civilian objects, the burning of civilian property, and the commission of or the threat to commit other crimes, calculated to terrify the population and make them flee the area with no hope of return. For example, in Kristich, the ICTY found that the shelling of Srebrenica and the burning of Bosnian Muslim homes was calculated to terrify the population and make them flee the area with no hope of return. This constituted a context, situation, and atmosphere that deprived civilians of a genuine choice to remain. Consent induced by force or threat of force is not real consent. The mere threat of resorting to force or physical or mental coercion may be enough if the targeted population facing this coercive climate or these threats has no other choice but to leave its territory. It is the absence of genuine choice that renders removal unlawful. However, there must be a link between the conduct and the resulting effect of forcing the victim to leave. My colleague, Elizabeth Fray, will now discuss the coercive environment analysis.
Thank you, Aysha. Based on our analysis, the context, situation, and atmosphere prevailing in Syria created by the attacks on healthcare resulted in a coercive environment. First, the circumstances under which the population lived were characterized by patterns of violent actions by the Syrian government, calculated to deprive the civilian population of healthcare services. As explained in our factual findings, the patterns described by our witnesses can be divided into 4 categories: attacks on healthcare workers, torture in hospitals, attacks on medical facilities, and restrictions on the freedom of movement. Second, due to the Syrian government's decimation of infrastructure, supplies, and medical workers, the civilian population was forced into a situation without a functioning healthcare system. As explained in our factual findings, witnesses described being unable to access healthcare due to a lack of facilities, supplies, and personnel. Third, the lack of healthcare contributed to a pervasive atmosphere of terror and trauma, as explained in our factual findings. And according to the IRC, nearly half of Syrians were afraid to seek medical attention because health facilities were deemed unsafe due to the attacks. Therefore, our analysis shows that the context, situation, and atmosphere caused by the attacks on healthcare created a coercive environment. Next, this coercive environment deprived the population of a genuine choice to remain. In Kristich, the shelling of Srebrenica forced approximately 25,000 Bosnian Muslims to be uprooted. The ICTY found that the Bosnian Muslims of Srebrenica were not exercising a genuine choice to go, but reacted reflexively to a certainty that their survival depended on their flight. Similarly, Syrian civilians were not exercising a genuine choice to go, but rather responding to the reality that staying would likely lead to death. For example, our witnesses, who were also doctors, reported leaving because they believed that they would be detained and killed by the Syrian government for providing medical aid to civilians perceived to be opposed to the government. Other witnesses said they were forced to leave in search of medical care. For example, after sustaining a bullet wound, one witness felt a lot of pressure to leave because he knew that without adequate medical attention, a superficial injury could become a death sentence. Furthermore, as documented in a recent IRC report, major periods of displacement coincide with attacks on health facilities. In conclusion, we find that the attacks on and deprivation of healthcare amounted to the forcible displacement of Syrians, because the context, situation, and atmosphere prevailing in Syria created by the attacks on healthcare resulted in a coercive environment, and this coercive environment was calculated to deprive the population of a genuine choice to remain. The next element in our analysis is lawful presence. Whether a person is lawfully present is liberally defined. What is important is that the protection is provided to those who have, for whatever reason, come to live in the community, whether long-term or temporarily. The requirement for lawful presence is intended to exclude only those situations where the individuals are occupying houses or premises unlawfully or illegally, and not to impose a requirement for residency. We found that the civilians were lawfully present because they were citizens or long-term residents of Syria. In the final element, grounds permitted under international law relate to a country's power to restrict the freedom of nationals and aliens who are lawfully present to move within their territory. However, if the alleged crime against humanity occurred in the course of an armed conflict, humanitarian law may provide justification for the displacement. We found that these deportations were not permitted under international law because the deportation was not for the protection of civilians and they were not for military necessity. In summary, we conclude that based on the weaponization and deprivation of access to healthcare, the elements of the crime against humanity of deportation are likely met. I'll hand it off to my colleague Jacob Demree to discuss our recommendations.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Given our findings and conclusions, we make several recommendations for achieving justice and accountability in Syria. First, we recommend to the government of Jordan, the Security Council, the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, or ICC, and the international community writ large that they fully cooperate to initiate ICC proceedings and an investigation into the crime against humanity of deportation occurring within Syria. An ICC investigation could lead to individual criminal responsibility for acts, such as attacks on health, that leave the Syrian civilians with no real choice but to remain, but to leave by creating a coercive environment. Prior attempts by the Security Council to refer the situation to the ICC have failed. Given the recent decision authorizing investigation to transborder crimes in the context of Myanmar and Bangladesh, however, the deportation of Syrians into states party to the Rome Statute, including Jordan, should give the prosecutor jurisdiction to investigate. Second, we recommend that the United States and the international community cooperate to pursue accountability measures beyond the ICC. For example, the UN General Assembly should pass a resolution establishing a hybrid tribunal on international crimes occurring within the territory of Syria. An ad hoc criminal tribunal created first without the Syrian government's consent and second by the General Assembly and not the Security Council would be unprecedented. However, given the facts we've described as well as the legal analysis, in addition to the General Assembly's authority under the UN Charter, we believe that such an extension of the General Assembly's authority would be warranted. We also recommend that the international community move beyond accountability measures to develop a reparations program to support the Syrian people. Finally, states receiving refugees from Syria should consider domestic trials, as have countries in Europe, to hold Syrian government actors accountable, as well as fully cooperate with the UN, the ICC, and human rights non-governmental organizations pursuing justice and accountability in Syria. In this presentation and in our report, we've explained that the Syrian government's attacks on health contribute to a coercive environment, leaving civilians with no choice but to flee. We hope that our analysis of those facts under international human rights and criminal law support movements for accountability and justice. Please check your emails later this spring for a final copy of our report, which will detail this analysis in greater depth. Now, to moderate the question and answer portion of today's presentation, I'd like to introduce our professors, Melissa Stewart and Scott Gilmore.
I was just going to say, it's so nice to be with you all again today, this afternoon. I'm Melissa Stewart, the Dash-Muse Teaching Fellow and an Adjunct Professor of Law here at Georgetown, and I'll pass it off to my colleague, Scott Gilmore.
Thank you, Professor Stewart. My name is Scott Gilmore. I'm an adjunct professor at Georgetown and of counsel at the law firm Hausfeld. I first just want to applaud the students from the fact-finding practicum on the phenomenal work that they've done this year. A very thoughtful approach to investigating a very delicate situation, contemporaneously investigating war crimes and crimes against humanity while these crimes are occurring and the population is still very much at risk. We're going to open this up to questions. I believe we have the first question of the day. Why is the Syrian government attacking Syrian hospitals?
I can take one. I think for that question, our analysis relies a bit more on secondary sources because we weren't really able to derive conclusions from interviews on things like strategy. But based on our research, I would just say that there's been a lot of researchers who have concluded that attacks on health are part of a broader strategy of war, derived to either kill or injure people perceived as opposition, and also to displace them. And now a lot of the perceived opposition has been concentrated in Idlib and parts of Syria, in that part of the country, in part based on the strategy, as a result of the strategy of the Syrian government.
And if I could just add to that very quickly. In terms of the rhetoric surrounding these attacks on hospitals, the Syrian government has justified their attacks by saying that they don't function as hospitals anymore, that they have been used by quote unquote terrorists, by the opposition, that they have then become military targets and not protected medical locations. But in our analysis and in other people's analyses, it has been shown that, in fact, they're not medical or they're not military targets. They are still functioning solely as medical locations, as hospitals. So that is not a legitimate justification under international law.
Let's take another question. For the panelists, could you explain more why your research question focused specifically on the right to health?
So I can take that one, and that's a good question. So as Hibah explained at the beginning of the presentation, there are really two aspects of the Syrian conflict which we wanted to focus on. So first, there's displacement. We know that over 6 million Syrians have been displaced outside of Syria, as well as 6 million Syrians displaced internally. Another feature of the conflict, as we discussed a little bit in the last question, is attacks on health. And these plainly violate the right to health. So given the recent Myanmar decision, which authorized investigation into transborder crimes, again, in Myanmar and Bangladesh, we looked at these two aspects, again, displacement and attacks on health, through the lens of a coercive environment to see if we could somehow find a pathway for accountability. And so, again, by taking these two characteristic elements of the Syrian conflict, we're able to really analyze the law through a coercive environment and international criminal law lens to basically enact the right to health, make the Syrian government's actions on that front subject to accountability through international measures.
There's another question that came in from our audience asking, how did you manage to get access to your interviewees?
I can take that one. We spent basically the fall semester really delving into and understanding the Syrian conflict. And obviously we're very lucky to have Professor Gilmore and Professor Stewart who have worked on these issues. But what we did was really try to identify civil society organizations, other lawyers and experts who've worked on the Syria issue and consult them to identify who we should be talking to. And through this process and through their help, thankful to all of these individuals, we were able to identify witnesses who were based in Europe and some in Syria as well, and just get them on Zoom. The power of Zoom was helpful in this case. So we were able to talk to witnesses all around the world, actually, which was very helpful for our research.
And I would just add to that we also tried to speak to a broad cross-section of people. So folks who were, involved in advocacy and civil society, and then used kind of snowball sampling and methodology to find people with different varying experiences to make sure that we were capturing at least a sliver of the breadth of experiences.
I'd like to get a sense of the time frame for the patterns of attacks on health that you've described. Could you share with us any thoughts on when these patterns began, whether they evolved over time, and whether any of them are continuing to this day?
I can take that one if others want to add. But we've seen that these patterns started at the beginning of the conflict in 2011, in the sense that protesters who went to hospitals for injuries that they incurred during demonstrations were attacked, were discriminated against, and some of the types of attacks that were going on in prisons also started from the beginning. However, other types of attacks, like aerial attacks, increased as the scope of the overall conflict increased. And so there were some changes in that. There were more aerial attacks, I believe, starting in 2012. But attacks on healthcare, as we've defined them in the report, started at the beginning of the conflict in 2011 and are continuing to this day.
We have a question from the audience that asks if you can talk about the challenges that you encountered in terms of gathering critical information, especially during a pandemic. And if you could elaborate on if there were any witnesses who didn't feel that they could speak with you for safety reasons and how you handled any of those issues.
I'm happy to start. We did have a few witnesses that decided that they did not want to participate in our witness interviews, and obviously we respected that. We also had some witnesses who, for example, preferred to keep their camera off, and of course we respected that. But for the most part, I think I'll let my colleagues also add to this, because we were in different witness interviews. Most people were interested in sharing their story, and that's where you sort of see the breadth of the factual findings section, what really added to our findings section.
I would add that we just had like the kind of basic logistics challenges you could imagine, time differences, language barriers. We worked with an interpreter, so we would have to have the interpreter and our witness and us all kind of lined up. Obviously, security. We use different platforms: WhatsApp, Zoom, Signal, whatever worked best. We let the witness guide the format in a way that would make it most comfortable for them, because their security was our top priority in conducting these interviews.
And just to add to that quickly, one of the interesting, side effects or silver linings of conducting our fact-finding virtually is that while there were lots of challenges in terms of accessing our witnesses, and, lining up interviews and, the logistical challenges, as Elizabeth talked about, we had a bit more flexibility in terms of who we could interview and when we could interview them. Normally, if we had been in person, we would have access to a limited number of people, geographically speaking. But because we were conducting our fact-finding virtually, we were able to speak with people who are still in Syria, people in Jordan, Lebanon, Turkey, parts of Europe, the United States, all around the world. And so that, I think, was a real benefit in terms of, as Aysha said, the breadth of perspectives that we were able to get.
We have another question from the audience. Can you explain why you chose to name only anti-government forces without detailing the different groups, such as separating legitimate protesting civilians from groups like ISIS?
So I could, no, Hibah.
Okay, I can just go ahead and get us started and then pass it over to Jacob. I had mentioned early on that our research question was inspired by the Myanmar decision. So we wanted to focus our research on a similar type of question, accountability through international criminal legal instruments. And so throughout our interviews, people did explain that they felt unsafe because of the government, but also because of Islamist groups like ISIS. But we're looking at criminal accountability through international legal instruments, particularly the International Criminal Court. And that's where jurisdiction tends to be more limited to states, such as the Syrian government. And in this case, not quite the Syrian government, but potentially through Jordan bringing it to the ICC. So it's a more nuanced question, and I do appreciate that clarity and that distinction between ISIS and other protesters.
And just to add on quickly, I think the question raises an interesting point about the Syrian government's characterization as well. We found through secondary source research, also talking with the interviewees, that protesters are characterized frequently as terrorist groups or as terrorists. And this justifies a lot of the government's efforts to arrest and detain, as we found, medical professionals. So it's a very good question. And I think that as Hibah described, that partly was a different definition of our research study, but that the difference between groups like ISIS and protesters, I think, is important and is central to how we approach the study.
Just to follow up on that question, in your analysis, would your analysis be any different if individuals that were denied access to healthcare, for example, being abused in hospitals, does your analysis depend on what their status was, whether those individuals were protesters versus members of ISIS?
So I can take that. I think that just in a simple answer is no. I don't think that the analysis differs too much. When you're attacking hospitals and medical infrastructure, those are defined under international humanitarian law as civilian objects. So those attacks themselves, at least from a basic theoretical framework, regardless of whether they're treating members of ISIS or other groups, that would not change the analysis. The way that could change the analysis, however, is if those centers are being used for military activities. We didn't find evidence of that, and if that's the evidence that was found, that would change some of that framework for the analysis. But again, based on the as I understood the question, with treating treating individuals, that should not dramatically change our international criminal law analysis.
And additionally, again, if I understood the question correctly, I don't believe that would significantly change our coercive environment and forcible displacement analysis as well, because while forcible displacement must be part of a widespread or systematic attack directed against a civilian population, case law states that that doesn't necessarily mean that every person who has been displaced must be a civilian. It's possible for some of them to be members of an armed opposition group, whether that is ISIL or a different group. So it would still mean that they would count as affected by these questions of forcible displacement.
Thank you for those thoughtful answers. Our next question asks, if in your research, did you uncover that international organizations have used access to healthcare as an approach or a means to seeking justice before?
Could I just ask for a little clarification? Do you mean specifically in the Syrian conflict or in prior conflicts?
I think you could answer either way. So if there were other analogous situations that you had found during your research, or if you find that access to healthcare is something that's really central to this particular issue as well.
I think we had a clarification from our audience member that they would like to know from prior conflicts if international organizations have used access to healthcare as a means of seeking justice.
So I think perhaps it would be helpful to distinguish, international human rights law from international criminal law here, because, so for example, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, those countries that have signed on to the optional protocol of that convention, that permits NGOs and other actors to file complaints of violation of international human rights law under that convention. So that's certainly an example of accountability in the human rights space. In the criminal law space, we haven't seen evidences of linking attacks on health to forcible displacement or other crimes against humanity like we've done in this report. I don't know if anyone else wants to add, but that would be my response.
I actually have a related follow-up question. In the jurisprudence that you examined on coercive environment or deportation, to what extent have international criminal tribunals looked at health as one of the factors to be considered?
I'll let others jump in here if they'd like, but I think that we didn't see health mentioned specifically a lot in the case law. And so because of that, we really had to kind of analogize to those cases. It was more things like, destruction of property. We did find a case where, that mentioned the deprivation of health insurance, but we're pretty confident that that in itself would not be enough of a factor. So it's more like things like, as I mentioned, attacks on property, attacks on persons, that sort of thing, more so than attacks on health, specifically in the criminal law cases that we looked at.
I would just follow up and add to that by saying, I agree with Dennis. We did have to analogize here, but courts have looked at like the overall environment, right? And that's why we talked about that context, situation, and atmosphere, because what we're looking here is conditions of life, right? So not just the burning of houses or the shuttering of businesses, but all of these things taken together that create an environment where the context, situation, and atmosphere is one in which people aren't able to exercise genuine choice whether to leave. They have essentially been coerced from their community because of that totality of circumstances.
Excellent, thank you. I think we have time for just one last question. During your interviews, did you also get a sense of the trauma your interviewees experienced? And what do your interviewees hope for?
I can begin that question and other people can jump in if they want. I think we definitely got a sense of trauma from many of our interviewees. We actually spent last semester studying trauma-informed interviewing techniques so that we could interview to the best of our ability, ethically, responsibly, and sensitively, these people who have gone through really difficult life experiences. And just on a personal note, I think it was incredibly moving to hear these interviewees' stories and what they've gone through, and to have them be willing to share those stories with us, especially when they're sometimes so painful. And in terms of what our interviewees hope for, I think it's different for every single person. You know, everyone has specific hopes and aspirations, and, you know, concerning justice in Syria, I think, you know, some people want to return to Syria. Some people don't seem that they possibly could. And some people really want, you know, perhaps ICC jurisdiction, as we've been discussing. Some people want other sorts of reparations. And so there's a wide variety of opinions on what our interviewees wanted going forward, which was really valuable to hear.
If I could just add one thing to that. I think we asked everyone we interviewed if they would ever consider going back to Syria. And we really saw how much people love their country. And for the most part, every interview that I can think of, the person would like to go back, but not with the current government in place. So that was something that I think we heard pretty frequently. But there is a desire to go back, just not with the Assad government in place.
And then just to add on one last point about that, I think that what we learned a lot during the discussions as well is that that many of the interviewees want to be a part of the future discussions. In one way to view the Syrian conflict is a way to view a government that is not taking into consideration the needs and hopes of its people. And I think that in any accountability moving forward, as Beth Van Schack talks about in her book as well, is that it's essential that all of us, whoever's leading the movement, should be Syrian. The person leading accountability and part of the discussion at every stage should be representatives of the Syrian people to make sure that the future truly is just. And so I think that will wrap up our discussion today. So thank you so much for attending. I'd like to pass it over to our Professor Melissa Stewart to wrap up.
Thank you so much, Jacob. And I just want to take a moment to thank each and every one of you who attended the Dash conference today. We are so thrilled that you took time out of your busy schedules to come and join us for this important conversation on justice and accountability for atrocity crimes. I just want to take a brief moment to again thank all of our professors and panelists who joined us today. And I'm thanking on behalf of Professor Andy Schoenholtz, the faculty director of the Human Rights Institute, and I. Thanks to James Stromsteth and David Luban, who worked with me to coordinate these amazing panels. Thank you to Dean Traynor, who introduced our fantastic keynote speaker today, Philippe Sands. And thank you to all of our panelists who shared with us their expertise and wisdom and thoughts on these pressing crises. Tom Andrews, Beth Van Schack, Pam Singh, and Todd Buchwald, Meg de Guzman, and Charles Jallo. We are just so thrilled with this program today. And also thank you to my co-professor, Scott Gilmore, for moderating this session with me today. We will be sending everyone who registered for this conference a link to the video when it's available. It'll take a few days with closed captioning, but we hope that you can share this with your colleagues, with your students as a resource, and that you stay engaged with the Human Rights Institute. Thank you so much for joining us today. And that concludes our conference.